world is changed forever by a new technology, nuclear. Two superpowers dominating the world, each facing the other in a state of neither war nor peace. This is the Cold War, where any push of the wrong button would lead to a global catastrophe.
Together we shall save our planet, or together we shall perish in its flames.
How the struggle between two political systems in the world caused millions to suffer.
Spying was very much part of the Cold War.
And this meant the world was meant to live in constant fear of a nuclear catastrophe. This is the Cold War, Part 1. In this episode, World War II is coming to an end. But the result is not the intended peace of the world. New territories are seized. Dangerous weapons are launched. This marks the beginning of the Cold War between the US and the Soviets. Cold War, the rise of the nuclears. Germany surrendered in May 1945, leaving Japan fighting the Allies alone. Terrible destruction was on its way to Japan.
Where there had been a distinct city below us, there was nothing down there but what, in my vernacular, was a black boiling mess.
Most of the city appears to have been obliterated. 4 square miles of desolation are reported.
And that cloud up above it was just tumbling and rolling. You could see the energy that was in it.
Hiroshima, the 6th of August 1945. As many as 75,000 people are killed on instant by only one single bomb.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT.
He was very hard-headed, including about, not losing troops in Japan, so he dropped, made the decision to drop the atom bomb once he knew about it.
But the party is not over yet. It's just the beginning.
That's the atomic bomb exploding at Nagasaki. All of you who see this picture can judge for yourselves the extent of the menace to civilization of this new weapon.
It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws his power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East.
The bomb has been used on human beings, not once, but twice.
It was a global world-scale war, so I think there's a very strong argument that the use of those weapons to end the war quickly without having to address a conventional invasion of Japan, very legitimate.
The USA celebrates the new super weapon as the only nation that possesses the bomb. A fearful weapon has been invented.
I don't think nuclear weapons were necessary to bring a swift end to World War II. Japanese scholars are now almost unanimous in saying, no, it was not Hiroshima and Nagasaki that led us to sue for peace. It was Russia's entry into the war that same week. That was the decisive factor. The one great achievement of nuclear weapons in most people's mind, that it did save a catastrophically prolonged war on the Japanese landmass, even that disappears on closer evaluation.
Will this power, now available to man, bring another, even more suicidal war upon us? Or can it be made to rule out war and open a new, progressive chapter of history, the atomic age?
The weapons used on Japan to end the war only created a new conflict. It's a conflict where large sums of money will be spent to create new weapons and technology. It will last for almost a half a century. And if it gets out of hand, it may end the human race. It's a nuclear race and a war, of course.
This is Movietone, rejoicing with you in victory.
3 months earlier in Europe, VE Day, victory over Germany, is celebrated. Adolf Hitler is dead. 6 years of horrific suffering have come to an end. World War II is almost over. As the guns in Europe become silent, a meeting in the US is held to ensure that a war like World War II should never happen again.
San Francisco, where 50 United Nations have been working for 8 weeks to produce a charter on which the future of world peace will depend.
It is now my duty to call for a vote on the approval of the Charter of the United Nations.
Dr. Wellington Koo signed first for China. Then, one by one, all the countries represented at San Francisco signed the Charter of Freedom and Peace on which the hopes of the whole world are centered.
This new structure of peace is rising upon strong foundations. Let us not fail to grasp this supreme chance to establish a worldwide rule of reason, to create an enduring peace under the guidance of God.
The United Nations is born. 15 nations signed the charter. Moscow joins the pledge for world peace. Despite a dark future, it's a moment of optimism.
Men and women chosen to represent the vast majority of mankind in this new effort to make life safe for the ordinary citizen throughout the globe. In a disillusioned world, some may think such a task impossible. But given goodwill, it is of course not impossible, and the alternative is world destruction.
Two major moments of history create the Cold War. The atomic bomb is one, and the threat of a nuclear catastrophe is second.
Communism is based on the belief that man is so weak and inadequate that he is unable to govern himself and therefore requires the rule of strong masters.
Communism, a revolutionary government in Russia since 1917.
Moscow's Red Square was the spacious and impressive setting for the Red Army's first victory parade.
The Cold War was actually a confrontation of two ideologies, communism versus capitalism. Simple as that.
Well, I thought communism was, in theory, better than democracy. But unfortunately, as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst of all forms of government except for all the rest.
Russia was always a doubtful partner for the Allies. In this case, communism is at odds with capitalism. Russia's Stalin is at odds with the West.
Brainwashed, educated at school to hate the West. The fat, big capitalists were bent on conquering the USSR.
Known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic since 1917 in the revolution, Russia is led by Joseph Stalin and as the General Secretary of the Communist Party.
This great leader of the proletariat, who was a genius of all times.
Today, Stalin watches with pride as units of the Red Air Force fly over the Soviet capital.
Stalin has big dreams for communism. He has already made a big move just before the meeting with the Allies at the end of World War II.
Palace at Yalta was the scene of the conference, a sumptuous-looking place which used to be occupied by the Tsar when he took a winter holiday in the Crimea.
Europe is to be divided among the four major victorious parties of World War II: US, France, Britain, and the Soviets. Germany will be divided into four. The eastern part will be ruled by the Soviets, which was occupied by the Red Army.
It is crazy. And the whole partitioning of the world between the great powers, as you know, in Yalta when they got together and they've kind of had this little piece of paper in which they scribbled, 70% of Poland to you, 20% to us, and all that, So, we've got to where we've got.
I think the government, because of the sickness of Roosevelt and the ascension to power of President Truman, trying to learn to deal with Stalin and Churchill, led to some belief that the Russians would treat the Eastern European better.
The Polish election was a test. The Soviets pledged a free democratic election in Poland. There was wrangling and delay, and when the election was finally held, it was a totalitarian affair staged by a Red dictatorship. Red Marshal Tito established a communist dictatorship in Yugoslavia. Hungarian Premier Nagy, whose democratic government was overthrown by the communists, a culminating violation of Soviet pledges of democratic liberty.
There was a rigged election in Hungary, which the communists rigged, or the Soviets rigged, and the communists came to power and Hungary became part of the Soviet orbit.
Slowly by slowly, the eastern countries of Europe go under Soviet rule.
You took it for granted. Soviets have liberated Europe. And therefore, we've liberated them from capitalists, from any other kind of ambiguity about who they were.
Winston Churchill publicly demands for a need to create a line dividing communist Eastern Europe from the West.
In the Baltic, to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Well, I think the Iron Curtain was a very big surprise, a very unpleasant surprise. I think it led to the famous speech by Churchill to wake up the Americans that despite all the costs and the great victory of World War II, there now seemed to be some people who wanted to cause more trouble, to create another warlike situation, and that country that was going to do that was the Soviet Union.
The United States tries to revive Europe with the Marshall Plan. This financial project intends to include most of the Eastern European countries as well as the USSR. local Americans get involved.
The Citizens Food Committee in America had been asking for public donations of staple foodstuffs.
He is giving generously, as are thousands young and old who wish to aid our friends abroad who face either untold suffering or communist control.
A friendship train, an idea sparked by a Western journalist in Washington that calls for generosity among U.S. citizens.
Its journey across the continent. Everywhere, great crowds turned out to endorse this expression of America's goodwill and practical aid for the free nations of Western Europe.
In addition to milk, canned goods, and other food products, gifts of money have been collected. Stockton, California is another stop on the Friendship route, over which the railroads are carrying the train at no cost as their part of the gift grant.
The train moves from coast to coast, collecting food, fuel, and clothing, making almost 40 stops on its way.
New carloads of vital supplies are coupled on at each stop, and the train is expected to arrive in New York in 2 sections, hauling 200 cars.
The cargo, worth $40 million, is shipped to France. From here, it is then given to the Europeans in support of the Marshall Plan. But Stalin refuses to allow Marshall support to his communist world.
Quitting the conference and denouncing the Marshall Plan. The cleavage between West and East becomes an economic division. The line of the Iron Curtain now separates Western and Soviet economic spheres as the representatives of the free nations of the West go ahead without Russia. The big powers invite all Europe to join the parley. All Soviet satellites reject.
You know, when we were leaving Lithuania, my parents initially thought they would do it legitimately. So they went to the Russian consulate and asked for permission to leave. And the answer they got is, says, listen, nothing leaves. Even the birds are not going to fly out if we can figure out how to stop them.
Barbed wires have closed up the East, and the Soviet threat is growing. The Cold War has just begun. Washington thinks Stalin wants to take up Europe and China. Fears of a Third World War begin. President Truman decides to build more atomic bombs. The first one will be tested in the Pacific Ocean on a tiny island known as the Bikini Atoll.
On Bikini itself, giant towers are being built for photographic observation.
This will be the first atomic bomb explosion since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But it is a dangerous experiment because no one knows what will happen next. The US military is determined to keep the details of its super weapon as a secret.
Carefully screened is wheeled to the B-29 that's about to carry it to Bikini. Not even a glimpse of this epoch-making missile is permitted.
The bomb is named Gilda.
And now it's time to go. Mission Crossroads has begun. Those without goggles shielded their eyes with their arms as the world's 4th atom bomb fell. Following the colossal flash, a great cloud rose 7 miles up into the sky. All can judge for themselves that the world is certainly at the crossroads.
The second bomb is tested 2 weeks later. and it will be 27 meters under water.
Two minutes to go. Dr. Holloway moves a switch, lights flash.
The bomb is named Helen of Bikini.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire. Radiation, smoke, fire, steam, water, a pattern of irresistible power recorded by a Movietone cameraman, among many others, recorded for all the world to see as thousands of tons of water swirling upward, a picture that epitomizes the colossal energy released.
The U.S. and its close allies were in possession of a weapon capability in the form of a nuclear deterrent that clearly had strategic implications.
An air view of an explosion equal to 50,000 tons of TNT. Scientists compute the temperature in the center of the atomic typhoon as 100 million degrees.
The temperatures generated by the bomb can melt steel and vaporize everything living. For now, the US has a military advantage. But aggression on the West behind the Iron Curtain is growing. US oil companies are lucky to get out of Hungary.
We were apprehended. We're taken down to this rather famous city station and questioned, sometimes not too pleasantly, and we spent the next week there.
But Hungarians are banned from leaving the country.
They were not so much terrified as frustrated by the lack of freedoms and the lack of democracy.
The jokes, and there were many, many of them, which were quite cutting and dismissive of Stalin. I'll just tell you a tiny little one, when there's somebody drowning and they get him out of the lake, and this person says, "You can ask me for anything you want. I'm Stalin." And they said, "Only please don't tell anybody that we've saved you."
But attempts to escape are met with horrific consequences.
This is the homemade tank used by a Czech mechanic to escape to Bavaria. Crashing through the electrified wire after a 30-mile drive to the frontier, he took his wife and 2 children with him, as well as a number of others who joined in his bold and successful bid for freedom.
It's a risky business nowadays trying to escape from Soviet-held East Germany to the safety of the West, but thousands have been making the attempt.
At that time, it was extremely difficult and dangerous because the borders were closed with electrified fences, landmines. It was extremely difficult to get out.
The dramatic story of the 3 Czech planes that recently landed at Erding in the American zone of Germany, some 20 miles from Munich, is a story of escape to freedom.
Mr. Kautsky here, who took the plane up from Prague airport and who has force landed it on the airfield, well, I should say on the strip outside of Prague. It took about 90 seconds before all of us were embarked, and immediately we took off. About 20 minutes later, we have crossed the border into the American territory.
Some of the refugees from communism are more than they seem.
In Newark, New Jersey, there's a radio factory worker who's escaped from behind the real Iron Curtain. He's Jonas Chernius, once Premier of Lithuania, who got away with his family when his country was taken over by Soviet Russia. How do you feel about it all, Mr. Chernius?
I am feeling very well. I am free. I have found very good friends and relative. I have to eaten. I am not more hungry. I am very happy.
People in the West are both scared and intrigued by what's happening behind the wall of the Iron Curtain. Intelligence reveals that countries under Soviet rule are preparing the young for war. Information is scarce, but life in the East seems to be difficult.
The ancient city of Belgrade, modern Yugoslavia's capital, presents a picture of particular interest, for it offers a glimpse of a country in Eastern Europe, which is today a focus of curiosity for Western eyes. From the peasants who come here to do their shopping, one gets an impression of sturdy types, some recalling the days when Serbia was a separate kingdom.
In Berlin, the Brandenburg Gate marks the boundary between East and West. But filming beyond the Iron Curtain was recently permitted. The once famous Unter den Linden now has a very new look, and our cameraman made these notes of the kind of shops and stores they've got. Street names, of course, have changed since Stalin and his comrades took over this part of the former German capital.
The Soviets occupied Eastern Europe purportedly to help them, and then they were going to withdraw and they weren't going to leave large troops stationed there. Turns out that they did, and as a result, in 1947, the Soviets were not going to leave Eastern Europe and let those people have their own country.
Obtaining news by Western journalists in the East is difficult and dangerous. Many are arrested and imprisoned.
After more than 2 years in a red jail, Mr. Otis was reunited with his wife on arrival at Idlewild Airport, New York. It's said that it was largely due to her personal appeal that the Czech government finally agreed to liberate him.
Bill, do you feel that the Czechs had any justification at all in arresting you?
That's pretty tough, too. That's complicated, too.
Did you feel...
And I'll tell you what. From their point of view, in certain respects, they had.
They did have?
Yes, that's true.
Could you explain?
The standards are different there. They look at things in a different way.
Most people in the West are concerned about the growing oppression in the East.
If the Soviet Union really wants peace, it can prove it by lifting the Iron Curtain and permitting the free exchange of information and ideas.
The Summer Olympics in Helsinki are overshadowed by the Cold War. The event was meant to bring countries together, but it didn't.
Helsinki, Finland's capital, is certainly a fine-looking town, and it was all ready for the games when we took these views near the Olympic Stadium with the swimming pool in the background.
The Eastern Bloc athletes were kept away from their Western rivals.
10 miles away is the so-called Iron Curtain village, where teams from Russia and satellite nations are housed. Here's the camp manager with some Hungarian girl athletes. Everywhere, of course, Iron Curtain signs are in evidence.
The world realizes that the Cold War is here for the long term. But not everyone in the West is against communism. Secret guerrillas are held in the south of Europe for communist takeover, funded by the USSR.
In Greece, a more dangerous crisis. Civil war developed. Greek government troops trying to suppress red guerrilla bands, aided by Soviet satellite countries Yugoslavia, Albania, Bulgaria.
The Greek government states that these gangs have been sponsored and trained mostly by Yugoslavia, that their object is terrorism and loot, and that there are well-known criminals among them.
The very existence of the Greek state is today threatened by the terrorist activities of several thousand armed men led by communists.
The Security Council hears the case of Greece. Mr. Saldaris, the Premier, charges Yugoslavia, Bulgaria and Albania with inciting a leftist rebellion.
The United States has received from the Greek government an urgent appeal for financial and economic assistance. Greece must have assistance if it is to become a self-supporting and self-respecting democracy.
The United States did not particularly want to get back involved in a war or back involved in the European nation's business, was forced to do so because of the recognition that without the help from the big country here, that the Greeks would go under and communism would spread even further.
The US responds by pouring in large sums of money, ammunition, and advisors to stop the spread of communism in Western Europe.
Fighting in Greece has gone on pretty continuously ever since World War II ended. It is, of course, part of the worldwide communistic plan.
Well, I think the likelihood of Soviet bases in the Mediterranean and in Greek ports, the ability of the Soviet Union to project power into North Africa, into the Middle East, would have been stronger, which is one of the reasons I think the United States helped them.
In Greece, heavy operations have been carried out against communist rebel strongholds around the Grammos Mountains near the Albanian frontier.
Greece becomes the first country in the Cold War to be used as a proxy between the two superpowers. It is the first fighting war between the US and the USSR, capitalism versus communism.
During the Civil War, you were on the right side or the left side. People who were on the left side, they went up to the mountains to hide and fight. I was born in Sparta, 1938. We lived in fear. My father kept his position neutral. He didn't want to be involved with any other parties. Civil war is a very sad thing. And actually, it's a dangerous thing because you fight for an idea. You don't fight for your whole country. It was brother against brother.
The pictures that follow illustrate his complaint of what is going on in Western Macedonia. Refugees moving away from the mountainous districts where the rebels are said to be operating from well-established camps, and Greek regulars on their way to engage and round up the gangs described as bandits. On February the 10th, some 600 Greek rebels attacked in the direction of Salonika. They were defeated by regular troops. Half of them were killed and about 120 were taken prisoner.
We used to walk to school. A police station was very close by our school. And as we really reached the gate, I turned around, and to my horror, there were heads outside the police station. Quite a few heads, just the heads outside. And the scary faces. And I was too scared to turn around and look again. It was just the heads. What they used to do that to tell people, well, if you go with the left side, that's what's going to happen to you.
A number of women were among those captured, none of whom seemed to be in very good shape, nor to have anything much in the way of equipment. After being rounded up, they were marched through the streets of Salonika, escorted by government soldiers, and followed by large and excited crowds of civilians.
After 4 years of intense fighting, the communist rebels are defeated.
The Greeks probably would not have been able to win the Civil War in 1947 by themselves.
The West has stopped the Soviets from gaining another territory in Europe. The 2,500 years Acropolis stands as a witness of the end of another war in its long history.
The sailors lost no time in visiting the Acropolis, where they were entertained to a display of dancing by the Greek army. Watching this, it's hard to realize that the F-zones are among the toughest fighters in the world. But the real fun came when the American visitors were asked to join in. Obviously, this Greek version of the Palais glide was a bit complicated for mere jitterbug fans to master all at once.
Communist forces attempt a similar outcome on the other side of the world.
I wish to express my appreciation for the interests and sympathy shown to my country, China, by our American friends.
The United States faced a very difficult decision in trying to keep China from being communist. There had been a civil war going on between the forces of the communists, Mao Zedong, and the nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-shek.
Life for ordinary citizens in China is brutal and primitive. It's not hard for communist forces to gain followers in China to fight the government.
Manpower and manpower alone hauls the boats upstream and over the rapids with cheerleaders to encourage the men.
The communists in Russia and in China both were able to hypnotize and to propagandize and to convince, persuade the peasants in their countries, the poor people, that they had been taken advantage of, that the rich people had all the money, all the counts and the princes and the upper level people were corrupt. As far as the peasants were concerned, if the communists took over and shot everybody that had money, you know, at that point they were so beaten down and brutalized and had nothing to look forward to that they figured, well, you know, why not give that a try?
The US is not ready for a communist China, and it aids the government to fight the communist rebels backed by the USSR.
The battle for the city of Suzhou is joined. Less than 180 miles from the capital, Nanking, nationalist forces dig in for a losing fight. The 400,000 nationalists are armed largely with American weapons, and 105mm guns open a barrage.
Just like in Greece, the war in China is between the US and the USSR as a proxy. The US is supporting the anti-communist government, while the communist rebels are backed by the Soviets.
Town lasted for some time, and rice had to be brought in by air. Planes rushed up supplies for the defenders of the city and flew out the wounded, though latest reports tell of 20,000 casualties eventually abandoned in the retreat. The military situation from the nationalist point of view is very grave. They claim that the communists are kept supplied by the USSR, saying that the Chinese Reds captured in the battle were armed with modern military equipment from Russia. Today, communism has swept like a red tide over this ancient civilization from the old capital of Peking down to the Yangtze and Nanking.
I was born in China, in Shanghai actually. Western democratic sort of system couldn't work in China. If you look at the history, you know.
On the 1st of October 1949, Mao Zedong, a communist rebel, proclaims the People's Republic of China.
There probably are some that would make the argument that China is better for having communism than if it had a corrupt democracy. That's arguable. I would have preferred a corrupt democracy that we tried to help become less corrupt.
Those years, my time in China, when the Mao Zedong was ruling, of course it's a dictatorship, right? You could say nothing apart from long live Chairman Mao, or love China, or love Communist Party, you know, all the songs, the music, and everything in the school books, everything was like that. But it was a simple life. The relationship between people were warmer, and the moral sense was better.
As the East turns red, the Soviets make another move in the heart of Europe. Post-World War II Germany is divided into two independent states, where the old city of Berlin is under Russian-occupied territory. Just like main Germany, Berlin is divided into two, the East and the West.
After the destruction of Berlin and the end of World War II, it was agreed between the victorious powers that the German capital should be divided into zones for the purpose of occupation by Britain, America, France, and Russia.
To supply Berlin, there were 3 land corridors which were guaranteed by treaty, and a rail corridor between Magdeburg and Berlin.
But Berlin was 110 miles inside of the Russian sector of East Germany. They wanted us out of the city.
1948, as Berlin is to be held at ransom, the Allies introduce a new currency, cementing West Berlin as a part of Western Europe. But the Soviets didn't take it lightly, and Stalin ordered his troops to seal off the roads going to Berlin, marking the beginning of the Berlin blockade.
I was stationed in Germany when the Berlin airlift started. This was an attempt by the Russians to get us out of Berlin.
Marshal Sokolovsky's shutdown of all service transport between the sectors brought Berlin's railways to a stop.
And that was one way they applied pressure, where they blocked off all entrances, rail, air, and Autobahn.
The famous Autobahns were deserted, and even canal traffic was at a standstill.
Soviet brutality has been clearly demonstrated in Eastern Europe, and many fear for their lives for those living in Western Berlin.
There was only one way open to the beleaguered capital, by air. And at Western Zone airfields, supplies were loaded aboard transports which had been rushed to the scene.
The U.S. government decided we will keep millions of people supplied by air, and the airlift started.
Aircraft had limited carrying capacity in those days and very slow. It started off with the aircraft taking coal, other fuel, food, medical supplies, clothing, whatever, up to sustain the Berliners. After a very short time, it was realized that this just wasn't sufficient.
As winter approaches, something needs to be done as soon as possible. The British and American Air Forces come up with a plan.
In order to increase the number of sorties, they had a system where the aircraft would take off from West Germany, fly up the corridor, and land, offload the fuel, and take off straight away. They had enough fuel to get back.
The flight of over 150 miles over Russian territory was accomplished by relays of British and American aircraft, which landed at about 3-minute intervals throughout the night and day.
It's been estimated that 24 hours of the airlift is equivalent in organization and effort to launching a 1,000-bomber raid.
There were many, probably hundreds of lives lost, British and American mainly, just through crashes or bad weather or running out of fuel or whatever. So it was costly.
The US and the British prepare for the worst.
Here's the first of the superforts coming into land at Scampton, Lincolnshire. Altogether, 2 B-29 groups comprising 60 superforts were on their way, each aircraft carrying regular and spare crews. In addition, one of them brought a Pomeranian, a Mesket maybe, or a watchdog.
The B-29 craft that drove the atomic bombs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki are sent to the UK, and they are within range of Moscow.
Asked about the object of their visit, Colonel John Henry, the group commander, said this.
The purpose of our visit is a long-range training flight. We don't know exactly how long we'll be here. We'll be here for a short period of temporary duty.
For the Soviets, it's a provocation.
We have a right to be in Berlin, and we intend to maintain that right.
We have, of course, a situation in Berlin which may at any time precipitate a hideous world struggle.
It had the possibility of escalating and spinning out of control. It could be a limited confrontation, or it could be all-out war.
The world is in prayers. Will the US use their super weapon against the Soviets?
The Security Council of the United Nations is now facing its greatest test, the question of the Berlin dispute between Russia and the Western powers.
In Eastern Germany, protests are held, condemning the use of the super weapon.
Ending display of force, German communists parade through Potsdamer Platz, carrying banners which sing the hymn of hate against the Western powers, with particular attention to the United States. With the battered Reichstag as a backdrop, Berlin citizens again gather more than 200,000 strong to hear reassurances that Berlin will be held at all costs.
Next time, on the Cold War, the rise of the nuclears, both parties create a bomb that is 1,000 times greater than the atomic bomb of Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
Waves of the world's first H-bomb rushed towards the onlookers, and spellbound they watched something never seen before.
It was a capability that even those of us that helped invent it just couldn't grasp.
You got that sense of humanity being in danger of annihilation.
It was the cornerstone of mutually assured destruction.
A new war brings the world to the past suffering.
Expected entry of 300,000 Red Chinese across the Manchurian border may well precipitate World War III.